Hi, and welcome to the LinkedIn Live broadcast on the release of the ISM Manufacturing PMI Report. My name is Dan Zeiger. I'm a senior writer and editor for Inside Supply Management. That's Institute for Supply Management's member publication. I hope our American, Canadian, and Australian viewers had a terrific Labor Day weekend, and we're happy that you're taking the time to join us as we discuss the Manufacturing PMI for August. The ISM PMI Reports is a new name for our monthly suite of data, but the trends remain the same in August, at least in manufacturing. Tariffs, demand worries, employment reductions, and high prices. It all added up to a manufacturing PMI elevating only a tad to 48.7%. That's a sixth straight month in contraction territory. So there's a lot to discuss. So let's bring in the chair of the ISM Manufacturing Business Survey Committee, and I'm happy to say a bylined author in the upcoming issue of Inside Supply Management. We'll discuss that a little bit later. Her name is Susan Spence. Hi, Susan.
Good morning, Dan. Afternoon here on the East Coast.
Yeah, let's get into the August numbers. I mean, obviously the story for months has been demand. The new orders index expanded, which is typically a good sign. But as you said in an interview earlier this morning, these are not normal times, to say the least. The other three demand indexes, those are customers' inventories, backlog of orders, and new export orders, remain in contraction, and backlogs contracted further. That's obviously not ideal. Just give us your overview of that situation.
Sure. Thanks. I appreciate it. You're exactly right. You know, we would normally be very excited with a 4.3 point jump in 1 month, and especially as it put new orders back into expanding territory. But the other indicators making up demand continue to contract, some at a lesser level. I've been asked all morning, is this the trend of something good or is this a blip? And I have to say, depending, based on rather the panelist information and everything we're hearing, it's got to be a blip. I wish it were different. So we absolutely need to see several months of not only new order flow, but that flowing into production and backlog, and to keep that pipeline full. I don't see it happening with the current environment of uncertainty. As our report indicated this morning, we still have 89% of our panelists telling us that tariffs are a huge issue for them. We still have, for every person hiring, we have 4 that are not. We have, as you mentioned, continuing price expansion, a little slower, but 11 months in a row. So, the problem is, as companies fear what could happen to their input costs, they see it in some of the increases that they're starting to already see as their goods come in the door. But the uncertainty and, I would say, there was a court ruling, of course, we all know about, that's now going to the higher court. It's just more time with things not being settled, right? So it is not good. And the 69% of manufacturing GDP in contraction is also not good. So we would love to be hopeful, but we're not hearing anything from the panelists, and we're certainly not seeing in the news that certainty is starting to happen. And as long as the input costs could swing, double-digit percentage points, you're going to have customers that aren't going to order. And consumer goods, you're going to have people that just don't buy things, especially if employment may not be great in their lives. University of Michigan did a consumer index. They do it every month. It's down. It's down a lot year over year. It's down significantly month over month. So the turnaround is not going to happen, in my opinion, until we see more certainty. The panelists have been very clear since April. The uncertainty is making us want to stay in place and try to find other ways to keep costs low. But when you have, 50% tariffs in some cases, whatever that translates into the input costs, you don't overcome that with just austerity.
Yeah. That's a great opportunity for me. I don't know if I've ever discussed this with you before, but I mean, in the time that I've been at ISM, I've talked to a lot of professionals. I mean, demand variability is one of their biggest challenges, and I mean that's even in the best of times. When you see new orders tick up like they did in August, and I know you've been asked and given your answer, it looks, unfortunately, more like statistical noise or a tick instead of, something that may be more lasting. I think that's a safe assumption to make, given that things have been sluggish like they have been for 2 years. But just
Dan, if I can interrupt, if you look at the new order index itself, and this is in the report, there's 7 sectors that were in expansion. Only 2 of them are the big 6, right? Petroleum and food and beverage. Mm-hmm. So it's great that the others are up, but we also had expansion in the last few months in production for a month, and that's back down, right? Mm-hmm. So unless you have sustained new orders driving up production, with a steady backlog, but we don't have those things in those indexes.
Yeah. And then just talk about that. And I wanted to get at, the demand variability is so, even in how has that been heightened, in the recent environment?
The demand softening is, something we also look at. Mm-hmm. It seems, that I love that we measure 18 sectors because I like to look for patterns. And not every sector is the same, but it is the same enough so it's driving things in the wrong direction, right? Mm-hmm. So food and beverage, okay, so you have the consumers, right? There's an article this morning I read, it might have been Fortune, about where's milk going, where's strawberries going to go? Strawberries, maybe that's going to be a luxury good. Can you imagine strawberries? Maybe people will grow them in their garden now, but it's kind of like the egg conversation. And so, that's for everybody. And then, there's certain things that really are B2B type of things, but I'm seeing patterns across all, and it's one sector, depending on if they're part of the big sector, it's just not enough to lift everything. But the pattern of sameness across all industries are these tariff comments, 89%. 89%. We try to pick, we don't want a report to be 40 pages long, but it's like, please, where's the good news here? Right. Yeah. So, but people are saying remarkably the same thing. Our input costs are going up, but it's uncertainty. We have a deal. No, we don't have a deal. We have a deal, goes to court. We don't have a deal. That's got to really kind of, it's got to get relaxed. It's got to, people have to believe. My fear is that if tomorrow you had all these trade deals, I still think it's going to take some time for people to believe it's going to stick. Yeah. Right. Either because of a legal issue or because there's another strategy that's different. It's not good for the business world. And you know what these people are telling us, and consumers are now saying it, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, you were talking about the comments, and every month I pick one out and read it to one of our chairs, because I don't think the comment sentiment on tariffs could get any more profound, if not biting, but it does. And I'll pick one out and I'd share it with you and get your thoughts on it. This is from a respondent in the electrical equipment, appliances, and components industry, and he or she is talking about how tariffs has just been a wallop on multiple dynamics of his or her business. The quote goes, "We've implemented our second price increase. Made in the USA has become even more difficult due to tariffs on many components. Our total price increases so far is 24%, and that will only offset the tariffs. In 2 rounds of layoffs, we've had to let go of about 15% of our U.S. workforce, and these are high-skilled positions. With no stability in trade and economics, capital expenditure spending and hiring are frozen. It is survival." Kind of just elaborate on that. You talked about, being stuck in place because of the uncertainty, and, there it is in black and white.
Yeah. Not a whole lot of need to expand on it. One reason I chose this comment is it hits a lot of things, right? Mm-hmm. And I was particularly struck about the high paid, high skilled roles, mm-hmm. right? So not good. And anyone that's ever worked in manufacturing understands backlog is watched carefully, new orders are watched carefully, and as that goes, so goes the whole industry. I was 29 years in aerospace and 10 in transportation and logistics, the latter being a leading indicator. So just like manufacturing, ISM report sees the downturn first, so did transportation and logistics. We were a bellwether. Mm-hmm. And so if the economy is contracting and not expanding, you're going to see less goods on the road. And that's what's happening. I think it's interesting. There's a comment in there from the trucking industry, so not only aluminum and steel, right? Those continue to be up in price, but, they're seeing their orders just drop off the ledge. So that ought to give people pause. And I guess if there's a good news, it's not a silver bullet, but if folks are listening to what the business world is saying about what these tariffs are doing, and now we're starting to see it creep into prices because they're in effect. If you listen and believe what you're hearing, and I know I'm oversimplifying it, but there's certain things that the trade policy can do and certain things it can't do. And just, understanding that customers and consumers are going to act accordingly. If their jobs are at risk, or, they're seeing their brethren either laid off or not being, when the backfill's not being filled, and they see the prices of their milk and their strawberries go up, they're going to hunker down, right? It's what we do. It's what we did in the last Great Recession is, we better just hold on to our hard-earned dollars, because who knows what's going to happen? Who knows what's going to, what the next price bump will be. So, thankfully, early in the year, January is a fairly strong environment, fairly low unemployment. So at least we're starting from a high, but, the question is, how many months of erosion will happen before we go tip, right? And I'm not trying to be an alarmist. I believe what these people are saying. Obviously, they see it first across these sectors. So I hope people do, take a look at our reports, look at the history of how long we've been at it for. And, it's not always good to be right. We think we're right. And, we want to have certainty in, the business world, so that they could get back to the business of producing goods and, selling good quality products and helping us thrive.
Yeah. One last thing on the tariff situation, and hopefully we can move on. But I mean, as we talked about earlier, you had mentioned that there was a court ruling, an appeals court ruling last week. But yeah, I don't think there's going to be any clarity there, or you can make any assumptions until the Supreme Court weighs in. And I'm sure there are purchasing professionals in our audience who know exactly what they're going through right now, because they're going through it right now. But for those that aren't, and I know you've related your time as a purchasing, as you discuss the data. Yeah, just explain that, how much uncertainty on your input costs when you don't know what they're going to be from 1 week to the next, how that impacts your operations, and especially when you have to report to the C-suite and hit targets.
Yeah, I'm having a little PTSD about that. Yeah. Really glad I'm retired.
Yeah.
So as a purchasing manager, so let me back up and maybe what's not known, certainly is probably known by our audience, but in general, certainly the companies I looked at, but you have a revenue number for a company, the price of the goods and services, both direct and indirect, product and non-product, is typically about 50% or more, 50, 60%. So if the cost of the items you're buying to put into your final product that you then sell, or in services industry to put into the service that you deliver, if that's going to swing by 10, 15, 20%, depending on, how much of the bill of material is labor versus parts and input, then the company is going to be greatly affected by procurement costs. So these procurement managers are right on the front line trying to play these scenarios of, what if it goes up 15? What if it goes up 20? What if it goes up 30? Well, if it goes up that amount, then our profit margin is going to shrink. So where else in the organization could we save money? Not hiring people, austerity, you can only overcome so much of the cost increase by doing those things. I had to do it, certainly in aerospace where you had a 10-year cycle. I had to do it, but I didn't have to take 50% out of the cost of the product, or 40, right? And if I did, it was like, okay, go back to the drawing board and redesign the thing, because you're not going to do it the way we have it designed now. And that certainly happened years ago in aerospace for me. So other than replaying a scenario, and, you can talk about reshoring and resourcing, you don't get that much out of it. And frankly, it takes time. So if you need to move something from, a country that is now in the tariff sites, back to the US, depending on the sector, that doesn't happen overnight, right? And frankly, if everyone's trying to do that and demand is going to go up, guess what's going to happen to the prices of that US based, not saying nefarious things are happening, but hey, you know what? I got demand coming at me left and right because people don't want to buy XYZ from this country because looks like they got a 30% tariff. Well, you're going to say the market is going to support, the market will bear a higher price, and I'm going to increase it because everyone wants my stuff. So it's not that it can't happen, but when the tariff worries are across all these sectors as they are, and by the time you reshore, depending on the sector and lead times of, building factories, by the time you open your doors, is there a different administration? Is that all that go away? And now it was a bad idea. This is a really tough time.
Yeah. You had mentioned the ratios, and that was good because I had planned to ask you a question on it anyway, because you've been talking about it a lot in recent months, and the comment sentiment, they keep getting more and more wide as I've seen it since I've been covering the report. You mentioned earlier, I'll recap them: 15 negative general comments to every one positive one. 89% of the comments on tariffs were worrisome, and a 4-to-1 ratio on employment contraction versus gross. I mean, obviously, we report these numbers because you think they're important, but in recent months, with them, how much more attention should we start paying attention to them, or should we start paying to them because these ratios are just getting wider and wider?
I was always taught in statistics, 7 points make a trend. Well, sometimes it's 3. Mm-hmm. We're now at 1, 2, 3. We're at 6 months post inauguration day, right? Mm-hmm. Six or 7 months. So it's maybe less about that month's number, but the trend. So let's look at general comments, negative to positive. In February, it was 3-to-1. March, it was 2-to-1. April was on par, 1-to-1. Then it became 5-to-1 in May, 11-to-1 in June, 15-to-1 in August. That's a disturbing trend. And perhaps in April, maybe it was still bluster, but it's not anymore. The other, demand softening, 2.5, for every positive comment about what's demand going to, it's even though new orders popped up, for every comment about, demand's coming back, there are 2.5 that said it's softening. It continues to be soft. So I like to look at trends, and, the reason I can say with confidence is that the new orders doesn't seem to be a trend that's going to jumpstart, restart anything, is because of everything else that people are saying, right? Would I love to be wrong? Yeah, but I don't, unfortunately, there's nothing giving me confidence that we're at the start of something great. If tomorrow all these tariff deals got settled and weren't going to be overturned by the court, I still think you're going to have a fair amount of people that said, yeah, but what if the administrator just changes their mind again because there's something else they want from a country, right? That's what I would worry about as a purchasing manager, and then at some point it's like, listen, you got to, what's the term, fish or cut bait? You got to make your decision. But these are big stakes. Again, they're not 2-3% swings.
Yeah. Another statistic that you regularly cite, in August, 69% of manufacturing GDP was in contraction. Now that's down from 79% in July, which is a positive, but it's still an alarmingly high number. And you suggested in an earlier interview, it's really hard to see the economy thriving with manufacturing GDP and contraction that high. Elaborate on that a little bit.
Right. And if you remember the new orders index, there were 7 expansive industries. 2 of them were big 6, food, beverage, petroleum. I'm going to draw a conclusion that the 79 down to 69 is because those 2 industries, which are quite big, are now in expansion. But it doesn't, again, even for them, I don't see things that are going to give me confidence that that's going to hold. Right. So 69 is a big number. It's just big. It's big. So that, I believe in data and history and patterns, even though this is unprecedented time. But as we've been saying, and, thank you for the ISM members who are in the purchasing role. I think you normally are. Thanks for hanging in there. This is, as the other comment said, tougher than the recession of 08, 09 for some folks. COVID was really, really difficult because people were losing their lives and businesses were suffering, but you had a feeling of we're all in it together. Even the recession, right? We had a global financial meltdown and you had countries propping up their banks, right or wrong, but it felt like you had people pulling in the right direction to get out of this. This one it feels so combative. The Brazil comment was interesting on organic sugar. We don't have a trade deficit with Brazil, and they're talking 50%. And food and beverage, that's one of the big 6 industries. Okay, it's organic, I get that, but it's such a base commodity, sugar, and so you see that, and just hope that the folks making decisions are paying attention. And it's not that Sue wants to be right and she thinks she knows all the answers. No, this is the data. This is what the people are saying, and patterns, as I said it earlier, across multitude sectors that are very different from each other. That worries me.
Yeah. Camping on the industry trends, just one more question. Chemical products, we've discussed several times. That's a bellwether industry for manufacturing, including for a story that will be in the upcoming issue of our magazine, and I'll discuss that in a little bit. But that contracted again, and I believe that's the 4th month in a row. Is that a disturbing? How disturbing is that trend? And talk about any other industry news that stood out.
Chemicals are in everything.
Yeah,
that's why we pay attention. It's one of the big 6. That's why we pay attention. It's contracting again. That's why we pay attention. The trucking industry comments, I pull out of there. Transportation equipment is one of the big 6. And like we said earlier, when you have you have demand dropping off for the equipment that delivers, the goods around the country. Okay. A lot of that probably has to do with commodity prices, aluminum, steel, especially, but that's worrisome. That is worrisome. So the folks that see it first, manufacturing in general sees it before services and everything else. Transportation logistics sees it before anyone else, because that's, goods moving about the country, and trucking is not, it's not part of logistics, but the equipment is, right? So I worry about that. I pay attention about that. And chemicals are in everything. And it's not good. Not good.
Well, yeah, while we're on that, I'll just say that in the September-October issue of Inside Supply Management, we have a feature story on the value of the ISM PMI reports and how the data has been very forward-looking in recent months, as Sue has discussed here, particularly on employment, prices, and how companies are passing along tariff costs. That article has great insights from Sue, as well as some of our other experts. And also, like I mentioned earlier, Sue wrote the Voices column, in which she explains why she took the job as Manufacturing Business Survey Committee Chair and why that work is so important. So be on the lookout for that. I think you'll enjoy it and get a lot of insights from it. The digital edition will be out in a couple of weeks, and you can find that at ismworld.org/magazine. Well, we got about 5 minutes here, Sue. We haven't had a chance to really dive into a couple of index readings. Let's do that. Employment. That was one of the indexes that, I mentioned in the magazine story as well, is that, really looked forward in terms of how it related to other data and showed up later in other data. This month, it was 43.8%. That was up slightly, 0.4 percentage points compared to the previous month. And you had mentioned the ratio 4-to-1 contraction to growth. Just discuss that picture.
Sure. This contracting, although it's a bit slower than last month, it's the seventh month in a row that employment is in contraction. And we talked earlier about there's certain things that you do for austerity purposes. Labor is one of the first ones, at least in the industries I've worked in, is listen, if someone leaves, just don't fill them. Hang on for a quarter or 5-6 months if you can, because you can get a big pop from that. This is going on 7 months, right? And so, if your orders resurge, then maybe you go find the people. Job report, right? There was a big kerfuffle about, the adjustment of the job report. Was it June, July, and the BLS head was fired. And, I think there's one coming out later this week. I think
usually the first Friday of the month. Yeah.
Right. Okay. So on Friday, pay attention to that. right? It is that the revised job report, and, forget a little bit about the chaos of the firing and the number, and is it real, is it not? It was in line with what we've been seeing in comments, right? So I think jobless claims, I think, are up, and that's both the initial and recurring. Those are up as well. I think that's what Chairman Powell at Jackson Hole talked about, spurning. The jobs numbers are disturbing, and maybe it's time to reevaluate the position. I believe that's what he said. So, not good. Again, hire force manage ratio, April, just like general comments, for every person hiring, there was one laying off or not backfilling. That grew to 1 to 1.4 in May, 1 to 3.2 in June, 1 to 4.0 this month.
Yeah.
So the longer the uncertainty of the input prices, which is a huge driver of cost inside of a company and affects profit margin, the longer that uncertainty, the longer that positions are going to be open, or maybe other austerity measures like laying people off are going to happen. And the question becomes, how long does it go before you tip into that ugly R word? It's not a declaration, it's a concern. And hopefully things will get settled, and there'll be some reasonable measures that people believe, and then this thing can turn around. But I don't see it happening in this environment, and something very different happens. So we did. I think Tim had said back in March or April, it's going to be August, September. If things settled back then, that's how long it would take to see it. Well, guess what? It's September. So are we end of the year now before we see a turnaround? Yeah, a lot of it depends. Most of it depends on the administration.
Well, hey, Sue, we have a couple minutes left. That was all the questions that I had. Is there anything that I haven't asked, or that we haven't discussed so far that you think might be important to include before we wrap up?
Just a question I've been getting pretty consistently today from the 7 other interviews, and it's about weighing in on what can the Fed do, the interest rate cut. And I'll say the same thing I said a few months ago. That is not what these panelists are talking about. It is not, the interest rates are too high to have capital investment going on, to invest in equipment and factories or whatever. It is, we don't know what these input prices are going to do, and we're powerless over that. And therefore, right, we just don't hire people and, whatever. So, in normal times, that would be a pretty big lever. I don't know how big of a lever it can be. It certainly can't overcome the uncertainty from these economic policies. There's only one body of government that can do that. It's not the Fed.
But it is great. I had remarked to Tom Derry, our CEO, it just seems like, people have been paying a lot of attention to the ISM employment and the prices index, prices especially, as it relates to looking for clues for what the Fed might do. Maybe, not maybe almost as much as federal data, and that, that's been great. But as we like to say, we're not the Fed. We're just a collection of purchasing managers voicing their opinions and concerns. So
it's an opinion, but it's based on what they see happening. And what's great for those in the audience listening, it because you're in it. That role, and you see things before anyone else does, and you're in a significant role that is, like I said, 50% of revenue is usually spend or more, depending. You're in an influential position, you're in a really critical and important position, and your company should listen to you, and the government, I hope, and other businesses will listen to things like the ISM report, and hear what we're saying about patterns and history to some extent, although this is unprecedented. Right. So we can say what we think's going to happen, and or you could study what has happened and what is happening, and listen to the people.
Well, that's a good way to wrap it up as we look forward to what the next month's data will tell us. So onward. Hey, Susan, thanks a lot. I appreciate your time. Hey, thanks for joining us today. For more information, you can go to ismworld.org, where you can read our roundup article that discusses a lot of what Sue and I have talked about here. And if you want to be a part of the ISM Manufacturing or Services Business Survey panels that help compile data for the ISM PMI reports, visit ismworld.org/join the panel for more information. So join us on Thursday when we break down the ISM Services PMI report with Steve Miller. He's the chair of ISM Services Business Survey Committee. So for Sue Spence and the people who helped us behind the scenes, Christina Cahill and Jennifer Stevens, I'm Dan Zeiger, and we will see you next time.